And we will address questions as well. And any questions that you have, to the best of our ability, we'll address all of those questions, from Liberia to Ghana to where we are now, and how all of this, as the master teacher has explained, he had to wait for this particular time. His words is that he had to wait for the sabotagers to leave. It needs to be stressed, and those who do have that connection, that spiritual connection to the master, will have that overstanding and the acknowledgement of who he is, and the more confirmation as he always has, and always given us confirmation of his divinity. He said he had to wait. He had to wait. No one else's control, no one else's time but his time. He is deciding the day. He has decided the day that he will walk out of those doors. No one else. It's no one else's their own interpretation of when it will happen and how it will happen. He has made the decision. And once he makes the decision, then so shall it be. So we're going to go into where we are now in reference to our fight and our status as the United Nation of Nuwaupia. We are the United Nation of Nuwaupians. And our land is considered, and has always been considered, sovereign. We have always declared our sovereignty. We have always established and honored and respected and accepted our president, His Excellency, Dr. Malachi K.Z. York. Is that clear? I'm sure those who lived on the land know that this was laid out for us as a nation. And as a nation, our rights, several rights, not just one, over 25 to 30 rights of ours have been violated. Our president's criminal immunity as an internationally protected person, and declarations made by the UN, declarations accepted by sovereign nations worldwide, there's an acknowledgement that the U.S. has violated those rights. As Nuwaupians, we have to acknowledge that we are an equal nation to all other nations in the world. And no one has the right to govern us. No one has the right to place their jurisdiction over us. No one has the right to claim our land for any reason whatsoever. Whether in their laws they feel as though they would like to govern us and introduce their laws upon indigenous people, after we allowed them here on our land to set up their own governments through peace treaties and acceptances of signatures and just and fair compensation, which we allowed the Confederates to do. And this is all doctrine. This is not something that's being reintroduced. This is something that's already there, that's been in the doctrine, that's been in our Constitution. If you read the beginning of the Constitution, in 1992, June 26, when we accepted our Constitution by our president, the president of the Yamasee tribe of Native Americans, the United Nuwaupian Nation, or the United Nation of Nuwaupia. This is still in effect. This Constitution still holds its merit worldwide. It was not a plea or a constitution that says, will you accept us? This was not what this was labeled as. In here, you don't read, accept us, please. You don't read, government, please acknowledge us, U.S., or China, please acknowledge us. That's not what this says. And we'll read the beginning. The Constitution of the United Nuwaupian Nation, indigenous peoples, drafted by Makhu, Chief Black Eagle of the Yamasee tribe of Native American Seminole Creek Shoshone, Wichita mound builders, known as Malachi K.Z. York of the United Nuwaupian Nation, our president and Supreme Grand Master, June 26, 1992. And this is a warning. This Constitution is the Constitution of the United Nuwaupian Nation and was drafted for indigenous peoples of the Yamasee Tribe of Native Americans, United Nuwaupian Nation, guided by the Supreme Grand Master, H.E. Dr. Malachi K.Z. York Maku, Chief of the United Nuwaupian Nation. Today the title Maku is mispronounced as Miku or Miko. If you go further down into the Constitution, you'll see on page 6, this is a warning to any other peoples and nations, inclusive of the United States. This was a warning to them. Know that to violate our Constitution is to violate the drafted declarations of the rights of indigenous peoples. Part 4, Article 31 and 36, drafted by the working groups at its 11th session, and the Indigenous Peoples Earth Charter, which was adopted by the Carioca Conference, May 25th to the 30th, 1992, United Nations, the drafted Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The rights of indigenous people list from Article 1 to about 57. And these various articles are the rights as we have them, and we have claimed our rights, and they should be acknowledged as such. The rights of us being forced to gather on our indigenous land, that is a right. When the U.S. forcibly transferred our population off of our land, that was a breach of obligation. It was a violation. It was a law broken, an international law that says no country shall force indigenous peoples off of their indigenous land. You cannot do that. It's equivalent to taking Mexico and forcing Mexico to assimilate their entire population into the country of, say, Peru. Do you know how drastic that is? Do you know the effects of this violation had on our children? Our family members are dispersed. Our children have been forced, by being raised speaking Nuwaupic, learning their culture and identifying with their customs, they were forced to assimilate into a foreign land. This is close to genocide because it's an annihilation of us as a people. It's a disrespect for the indigenous customs and cultural traditions that have been laid out prior to them coming here. And we haven't even touched on the fact that they actually had the audacity to touch a head of state. They had the audacity to incarcerate, try, and convict a president of a sovereign nation. And this is what has to be sunk into our heads as members of our nation. Can anyone incarcerate the president of the United States? No. Even if a president commits human atrocities or crimes against humanity, they still don't incarcerate him because they can't. It's against international law. You cannot touch a head of state. You cannot touch a head of state's office. You cannot touch his governmental facilities. You cannot create propaganda that would discriminate against indigenous people. These are laws that they have signed on to and have agreed. 157 countries have agreed to these particular articles. And the list goes on and on. So when you're talking about our family, our nation, y'all have to acknowledge that these atrocities have been done against us. And this is the time we have to stand up. This is what the master teacher is saying. This is not coming from my mouth. This is not something that is being created out of thin air. This is documented. On June 30th, 2003, he stated in court, who was there? Who remember what he said to the judge? In respects to your government, you have no right or no jurisdiction over our government, my government as a sovereign indigenous member, as the president and head of the Nuwaupian nation. And they're acknowledging this in the prisons even to this day. The reason why they haven't lowered his security level is because they stated on the documents coming from Florence that Dr. Malachi York is the head of what? The Nuwaupian nation. What is a head? A head is a president. In international law, for those that don't know, when you breach those obligations, then they have the ability to incarcerate and try every last person that touched him, including the judges, including the officials that were working in the U.S. capacity, those that incarcerated him down in Putnam County, those that took the land. All of their courts have a responsibility. This is where reparations come in, where the master has explained for years that once he's out, we're going to own what? How will we own Georgia? Because that's our land. And they won't be able to pay for the days and the minutes and the time they had him incarcerated on top of torturing him. The torture suit, it was stated in court several times by several lawyers as well as him. Garland told Lawson that Dr. York would like to put on record that he is an indigenous sovereign person. The court lacks jurisdiction. Adrian said it before trial. He wanted it on record that the court lacked jurisdiction. People has often wondered why the master has never signed any motions. He's never signed any document that come to him for the courts. Why? It will render them jurisdiction. He will be requesting, as a president, he will be requesting a privilege or an appeal to a foreign government. He cannot do that. He has his own government. Where's his government? In international law, his government is considered in exile. It happens when another nation invades a foreign nation and removes their government and forces their government into exile. These are cases in international law. The Germans were responsible for removing Poland and their government and forcing their government into exile. This is where the Jews received from the international community the ability to set up their own what? State. They gave them a state because they acknowledged that they destroyed a so-called nation of people. This is where we come in. We have to stand up and make them acknowledge we're on the brink of destruction. Why? Because our indigenous people have been forced. We cannot practice our culture the way we would like. We're forced to move from building to building. And the U.S. knows this. That's why they haven't responded the way you think they should. Because they know that they have home court advantage. Because we keep going to them and asking them for, please free our president. Please help us. Please appeal this. Please acknowledge this motion. And they're laughing. Because that's not, as the master just recently explained, that's not the fight that he's ever wanted to fight. The fight that we have to fight is us standing up now, which he wants everyone who is a Nuwaupian to re-sign and re-acknowledge We still are a nation, regardless of whether we control our land. It doesn't not make us the state of Nuwaupia, the state of Nuwaupians. We are a state. In the international community, not to confuse a state as in the United States, but the definition of a nation in the international community is a land that a group of people with a common interest control, with a government in force. Our government has always been in force. Our president has always been the head. Our governmental office has always operated. Though we had our issues because of the United States breaching of its obligation, we are doing our best to reestablish this government. Because the United States has to pay for the damages to each and every last one of us sitting in this room, and any Nuwaupian that you know worldwide, they have to pay them. So for those who've left and have said, well, I'm not a Nuwaupian or I'm not a part of this nation, the master teacher cannot claim you. That's why he's always said those sovereign people want to claim sovereignty and run up ahead of him. What did he tell them? Don't run ahead of me. Because as a sovereign person, you can't have anyone claim you. So when you say you're sovereign, like these guys that go to court and claim their sovereignty, they don't have a people or government to back them. So the United States locks them up and keeps them incarcerated. You don't have jurisdiction. No one has jurisdiction over you. Okay, well, we'll wait till you decide you want to be seen by us. The master's always said what? Our president has always said that we have to what? Come get him. Not come get him physically as in force, but the mind and establishing the international community, and the U.S. has no issues. They cannot afford not to listen to us right now. We filed in the international courts. I don't know who has read it. Has anyone in here read it? The international court, the application? So I'm going to read a few excerpts from it so you'll see what has been filed in international court as a sovereign nation. A lot of people wanted to go the route of the international court. Many may wonder why it hasn't been done before. Because our president, Dr. Malachi K.Z. York, has said that he had to wait for the sabotagers to leave. All right? Is that clear? This is why this fight is on the table now, because he's deciding it. This is his kind of fight. I would like to read just a portion of our application, and there's 4 parts to it. In international court, you have disputes, and for those that come up, I'm going to take my time so we can be on the same page, and everyone mentally will really understand the direction that we're going in. In the international courts, you have a court that's been established under the United Nations as a court that addresses 2 types of cases: contentious cases and advisory cases, arbitrary cases. Contentious cases are disputes between sovereign nations. 2 nations, one nation has an issue with another nation. Peru having an issue with China. The Congo having an issue with France. These are examples. The U.S. having an issue with Iran. Russia having an issue with Germany. Whatever the issue is, whether it's an invasion, whether it's fishing on their territorial waters, this is the court that has the jurisdiction to hear these disputes. The reason why the U.S. is not being held accountable because we're bringing it to the wrong court. We've brought it to the wrong court. But it was necessary so everything could be put on record of our ways, which, in other words, we presented diplomatic ways to solve the issue. To establish coming to them in the court saying, well, we have a torture suit. It was ignored. We had motions that was put in. They were ignored. These things had to be put on record. So we have the ammunition, so they cannot say that they didn't know he was being tortured. They cannot say they didn't know he was the head of a nation. So now we're in the international court, and the international court, us as a sovereign nation, because no one has jurisdiction over us. Do you understand that? No one has jurisdiction over us. We have our own government and our own what? Laws. Where's our law? Patarak. This is our way. These are our laws established by our president, laid out for us. So no one has jurisdiction over us. No one can say what we do is wrong. Just because they don't like it and their racist mentality is the reason why they're going to fall, because of their racism. So we had to go to the international court and give them jurisdiction to hear our dispute against the United States. We had to allow the United Nations jurisdiction. And that's an application or declaration that had to be put in the international court that says, us as a sovereign nation, the government of the United Nation of Nuwaupia renders jurisdiction to the international court in the Netherlands, in The Hague, where they have chambers of judges that oversee, right to this day, they're settling disputes between sovereign nations. They're involved with the issue with Syria. They've been involved with issues in Africa and in Europe. Well, they have to get involved and settle this dispute between the U.S. and the United Nuwaupian Nation. So we allowed them jurisdiction. And in giving them jurisdiction, it allows them to oversee or to settle the dispute that we have about them kidnapping, torturing, and incarcerating illegally. And in no international law is that accepted. There's no exceptions to that. There's no dispute. In other words, there's no response that the U.S. can bring to say, well, we locked him up because of this. They don't even have the ability to argue that point in international law, in international court. They don't have the ability to say that we took these indigenous people's lands for whatever reason. Atrocities, crimes against humanity is happening worldwide. And they do not go and invade and take people's lands unless the people decide to remove the head of state. And that's why Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, the Syrian president right now is still in office, even though they're acknowledging that their government is murdering people. They still don't have the jurisdiction to go in and touch him. They had no jurisdiction, regardless if someone got a letter that claimed alleged crimes were being committed on our sovereign land. No one gave none of them the ability or the right to come touch anything of ours. They couldn't even come on and stamp a cease and desist building citation on our property. So these are the violations that have been accumulated. So in international courts, we presented to them an application to institute proceedings against the U.S. for violation of sovereign head of state and the violation of rights of indigenous people. And I'll read section 2 so we can get to the meat of it. The first two sections was the declaration. The second part was a letter to the international court. It's part 2 of the dispute. Part 2, which is a subject of dispute, because there's rules to the court. In this court, and family, this is all researchable. This is nothing that cannot be looked online. In fact, we encourage those who are involved to look online and look at it yourself. It's right there. The subject of dispute. The dispute has risen from the United States. This is what's in international court right now. The dispute has risen from the United States unilaterally attributing to itself universal jurisdiction over sovereign indigenous lands, people, and the internal and local affairs of the United Nuwaupian Nation, violating their right to autonomy and self-government. Therefore, breaching its legal obligation to the United Nuwaupian Nation by kidnapping, imprisoning, trying, convicting, and sentencing its sovereign head of state, President of the United Nuwaupian Nation and Sovereign Grand Commander, His Excellency Dr. Malachi K.Z. York of the Yamasee Tribes of Native Americans, to 135 years in Florence ADX Supermax Prison in Florence, Colorado, USA, a violation of the criminal immunity of a foreign head of state, an international customary rule recognized by the jurisprudence of the International Court. The dispute also relates to the failing of the United States to prevent and punish crimes and currently committing crimes against an internationally protected person by intentionally kidnapping, torturing, and currently torturing, simultaneously violating the human rights of the President of the United Nuwaupian Nation and Sovereign Grand Commander, His Excellency Dr. Malachi K.Z. York of the Yamasee Tribe of Native Americans. A dispute also arose from the United States acts which injured the state of the United Nuwaupian Nation by a non-jurisdictional land forfeiture proceeding held in the federal courts of the United States of America, which adjudicated a judgment of forfeiture, with a forfeiture claim which seized the indigenous lands owned by the United Nuwaupian Nation and forcibly displacing indigenous people, children, and families off of their land and territory, creating a government in exile, being recognized de jure. De jure is a Latin term for by the state of our existence, by the fact that we exist as indigenous peoples off of our land, is proof that this was done to us. The United Nuwaupian Nation invokes responsibility upon the United States for injuring its state by forcing its government into exile, which has damaged its state irreparably inter alia. Inter alia means amongst other things. The United Nuwaupian Nation takes the view that the breaching of erga omnes obligations of the United States to the self-determining indigenous, autonomous, self-governing people of the United Nuwaupian Nation was gross and unprecedented. These acts are incompatible with the state's obligations in the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes Against an Internationally Protected Person, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the agreed fundamental principles in international law, whereas all states are equal before the law, with equal rights and obligations under international law. Sovereign immunity from the jurisdiction of other states according to the maxim par in partem non habet imperium. A peer, an equal, has no jurisdiction over another peer. Fundamentally binds peace-loving states to their responsibilities and obligations of the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples who are free and equal to all other people and individuals. The enclosed application instituting proceedings sets out the facts underlying the dispute and expands on the legal grounds on which the jurisdiction of the court is based, the nature and grounds of the claim, and the statement of facts. In this application, you have to list the statement of facts, which will be read. The claim, the grounds of our claim. Our grounds and claims are based on the articles that have been breached, the international laws that have been violated by the United States. These are our claims. And we have a numerous amount of claims. We have claims of the fact that our children, especially in the international community, cannot be forcibly transferred from their land to another land. The characteristic of that is on the verge of a crime, which is genocide. That's genocide because in international law, and the laws of nature, when you remove the children and forcibly transfer children, you're affecting the genes of that nation. You're affecting the genes of those indigenous people. Therefore, it's an attempt to annihilate them. These are characteristics in international law that the U.S. knows, and they're hoping that we didn't see it. And you never hear how the U.S. loses. That's the spell that's been placed in this country, where Negroes often say, you can't beat the feds. You can't do this. Yeah, we know how weak he is. Yeah, we know he can be defeated. So why do they keep implementing, you can't do this and you can't do that? We never hear, we don't know the word can't. Let's get back to this. The statement of facts that we laid out to the International Court states as such. On January 15th, 1992, President Dr. Malachi K.Z. York Maku, Chief Black Eagle, and the United Nuwaupian Nation, or the United Nation of Nuwaupia, acquired 476 acres of land of its indigenous ancestors, family members, and various descendants of Native American tribes of the bloodline of Nuwaupians, relocating from their indigenous lands in the northern regions of the Appalachian Mountains. That's where we were. The kin to Ben York, who remembers that, upstate, who remembers the tribal attire, the Native American clothes that he specifically stated, don't question him about because he knows what he's doing. Niggas were like, I thought you was Imam Isa, when he was wearing Native American attire. Always trying to sabotage what he's doing, thinking they know the direction he's going, thinking he's in prison by accident. Okay. The regions of the Appalachian Mountains area renamed by the early Confederate settlers Sullivan County in the state of New York, where the native indigenous tribes yielded to Confederate settlement in exchange of signatures of peace treaties, land agreements, or fair and just compensation, allowing them to establish their government in portions of the area that became known eventually as the state of New York. The grantor of the deed to President Dr. Malachi K.Z. York and the United Nuwaupian Nation was Arn C.H.R. Layson and Sandra Gray Layson, and acquired property out of the indigenous lands of Native Americans historically known as Altamaha, in the southern region of what is now called the state of Georgia. What is now called the state of Georgia. Thus, in their right to self-determination and their right to develop in accordance with their own needs and interests, the United Nuwaupian Nation began to build and reestablish their social structures, educational systems, and cultural values that establish their ethnic identities and distinctiveness as a people, while having the right to autonomy and self-governing in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, with intentions of being free from discrimination of all kinds. The Declaration of Sovereignty of the Land and the People of the United Nuwaupian Nation came into force on June 26, 1992. The Declaration of Sovereignty and the Sovereignty of the Land and People of the United Nuwaupian Nation came into force on June 26, as it states, June 26, 1992, with the gathering of indigenous tribes of Yamasee Native Americans, Seminole Creek, Shoshone, Wichita mound builders, who on that date agreed to revitalize their cultural traditions and customs while engaging in traditional cultural gatherings. The United Nuwaupian Nation acknowledged and accepted the drafting of their constitution and maintained their unanimous vote of the selection of their president, His Excellency, H.E., Dr. Malachi K.Z. York, known and traditionally named Maku, a Chief Black Eagle. 2. The United Nuwaupian Nation began improving their economic and social conditions by improving their economical institution and educational facilities. Discriminatory attacks by the local law officials of the United States began approximately 5 years later in 1998. Local officials and self-appointed building inspectors working in the United States governmental capacities began placing injunctions of cease and desist orders of further development, asserting themselves jurisdiction by using their local city ordinances as a means to stifle their need to develop in accordance with their own aspirations. In the exercising of the United Nuwaupian rights, the threat of discrimination had begun with a plot of local authorities of the state of Georgia on the basis of an allegation by a disgruntled exiled tribal member reporting to the United States authorized officer, Howard Richard Seals, through the communication of a letter alleging criminal activities. The United States unilaterally attributed to themselves jurisdiction as a result of their investigation, a warrant issued by one of the United States Bureau for the arrest of our president, Dr. Malachi K.Z. York. On May 8, 2002, approximately around 3 p.m. U.S. time in Milledgeville, Georgia, the president of the United Nuwaupian Nation, Dr. Malachi York, was traveling with his governmental personnel, including his wife, Kathy Johnson, when his vehicle was parked, while his vehicle was parked in a public lot, was ambushed by 20 agents authorized by the United States Department of its Federal Bureau of Investigators and taken control of. These agents, using the element of surprise, broke windows, drew guns, aiming their weapons at the head of the occupants of the vehicle, including the president of the United Nuwaupian Nation, while violently grabbing the personnel out of the vehicle, illegally taking into their custody their persons for reasons unknown at the time. President Dr. Malachi York informed the agents of his sovereignty and international protection and diplomatic immunity that is attached to his office and the absence of jurisdiction authorizing this arrest. Simultaneously, approximately 60 miles away, which is documented as the largest in U.S. history, a parallel raid and ambush involving over 300 agents from various authorized agencies of the United States invaded and raided 476 acres of the indigenous sovereign land of the United Nuwaupian Nation, called by its tribal families, indigenous people, and thousands of Nuwaupians worldwide, the Holy Land of Wahani, known by many traditional names such as the Holy City of Kodesh, the Golden City, home of the headquarters of the United Nuwaupian Nation worldwide. The detaining agent subdued 300 families, including children ranging from infancy to early teen, expecting mothers and tribal elders. Religious temples and buildings were raided with excessive force, including tear gas and explosives, detaining and forcing children to sit unattended for 8 hours without food and water or shelter from the intense heat of the sun, causing severe suffering and mental trauma. These agents acted in an official capacity, used the threat of violence and death with the use of bodily harm as a form of intimidation against men, women, and children, using military helicopters, armed vehicles, freezer trucks, and body bags with the expectation of casualties of the raid. Seizing and controlling the governmental buildings, religious facilities, schools, temples of learning, religious sites, restaurants, entertainment halls, cultural museums, and spiritual centers, warehouses, farms, storage silos, music recording studios, the president's family's house and vehicles, while alleging to possess a warrant of search authorized by the United States to be taken control of, the United States to take control of the the Nuwaupian nation's land, searching for evidence of alleged crimes purported to have been committed by President Dr. Malachi K.Z. York of the United Nuwaupian Nation on the premises of indigenous sovereign land outside the scope of the jurisdiction of the United States. 5. In the detainment of President Dr. Malachi York, his torturous abuse began immediately. While being in the custody of federal agents of the United States, being deprived of food, water for days, causing severe suffering, President Dr. Malachi York has suffered and is currently suffering tremendously for the lack of medical attention needed to treat symptoms of acquired angioedema, a life-threatening blood condition that causes asphyxiation, being housed in a facility with convicted murderers and criminals sentenced to life terms and death sentences, being labeled by the penal system of the United States as the highest level of threat to society, heighten his risk of injury, possibly death and harm due to the criminal allegations and presumptuous of guilt attached to the president of Dr. Malachi York. He has been locked down in solitary confinement 24 hours a day without human contact and interaction, being abused randomly for the exercising of his right to his religious preference. The United States failed and is failing to take effective administrative measures to prevent these acts of torture, including beatings, extreme temperature tortures, sleep deprivation, physical bondage by wrist, feet, and head causing injury to his body, forcibly removing of teeth as a form of punishment for his religious affiliation. These acts have been committed by various officials, personnel, prison facilities that he has been transferred to over the last 10 years of his torturous, illegal, and inhumane incarceration. These torturous acts committed against President Dr. Malachi York has been documented and witnessed by official personnel, citizens of the United States, and the members of the United Nuwaupian Nation from his kidnapping on May 8, 2002 until the present date of the admittance of this enclosed application. 6. On January 24, 2003, in the Middle District Court by Judge Hugh Lawson in Georgia, it was evident that the United States' such purpose of inflicting pain and suffering on the person of President Dr. Malachi York was effective in their intentions by the fact of the guilty plea taken by him under duress as stated by Dr. Malachi York on record on June 30th, 2003 in the United States Middle District of the state of Georgia. On June 30th, 2003, in the above-mentioned district hearing with Judge Hugh Lawson presiding, Representatives Max Woods, Richard Moultrie for the government of the United States, and the stated defendant, President Dr. Malachi K.Z. York, misnomer Dwight York, accompanied by representatives of the government of the United Nuwaupian Nation, nationals, tribal elders, and family members convened for the purpose of the rejection by the courts of the illegally obtained guilty plea by the President, Judge Hugh Lawson. The President of the United Nuwaupian Nation stated, for the record, and on his own accord, with sufficient notice and communication to the government of the United States of his indigenous sovereign status and membership of a sovereign nation, which was first stated in this proceeding by Attorney Ed Garland on behalf of the President, Dr. Malachi York. In case number 502CR27CAR, refer to the Annex Document 1. 7. Furthermore, in this proceeding, the United States Court contends that they lack knowledge of the international obligation that the United States has to the international community. They lack knowledge of their international obligation and no understanding of what President Dr. Malachi York's position was through his counsel, which further breached the United States obligation to the United Nuwaupian Nation, forcing jurisdiction upon a sovereign head of state and delaying his immediate release, subjecting him to further torturous acts imputable to the United States. 8. The United States lacked international jurisdiction. Instead of finding proprio motu, and that the immunity of a foreign head of state had accordingly been violated, they continue on with the proceedings. Another breach of the obligation to his human rights occurred by failing to prevent any further acts of torture, degrading, or inhumane treatment against President Dr. Malachi York, as stated by him to the officer of the court. There is an international responsibility to relieve him of his duress and find these offenses punishable under its law. These acts are again imputable to the United States, making them responsible for these violations. Subsequently, President Dr. Malachi York was sentenced to an inhumane sentence of 135 years in prison. Number 9, there was much propaganda designed to promote ethnic discrimination against the United Nuwaupian Nation in the form of false media indoctrination. Claims of the purposes of their development was for intended uprisings. This propaganda incited fear amongst the state of Georgia's local authorities, county officials, political parties, and influential community activists and community organizations, inciting prejudiced views towards members of the United Nuwaupian Nation that was rooted in our ethnic identities. Discrimination was felt far and wide, with attributes such as hate group and suicide cult being attached to the United Nuwaupian Nation. Number 10, with the conviction and sentencing of the President of the United Nuwaupian Nation, His Excellency Dr. Malachi K. York, the United States instituted a final forfeiture claim against the United Nuwaupian Nation's 476 acres of sovereign land on July 12, 2004, in view of their domestic laws, which violated international laws. This act dispossessed the United Nuwaupian Nation resources, territories, and forcibly transferred an entire population of men, women, and children off their land, which in turn would force them to assimilate and integrate into other lands, subjecting them to a vast amount of discrimination due to their distinctive cultural practices and rights to maintain, control, and protect their cultural heritage. On August 27, 2004, in the United States Middle District of Georgia Division, the systematic attempt to confiscate their land was successful by a final order of forfeiture in order to vacate issued by the United States federal judge C. Ashley Royal was enforced. The entire population had to be vacated in an impossible 7-day time frame. 476 acres of land, 300 families, schools, governmental buildings, religious sites, temples, museums, restaurants, social quarters, homes, storages, warehouses, and farms, food and sustenance, personal property, including furnishings, computers, entertainment systems, temples reflecting their cultural expressions, intellectual property, thousands of religious books and documentation, historical literatures being housed in historical institutions, all to become vacant in 7 days. Need I go on? Let's continue. Seems as though we forgot this, huh? It's a reminder for those that's playing with our Father. These are our claims. And everybody that's claiming this, they're going to have to stand up now. Every Nuwaupian. The United Nuwaupian Nation claims the United States breached its obligation to protect and preserve the sovereign right of an indigenous head of state by failing to prevent and punish crimes and currently committing crimes against an internationally protected person by intentionally kidnapping the President of the United Nuwaupian Nation and Sovereign Grand Commander, Dr. Malachi York. Article 2, look it up, of the Convention of the Prevention of and Punishment of Crimes Against Internationally Protected Persons. Article 2, paragraph 1, a murder, kidnapping, or other attack upon the person or liberty of an internationally protected person. Each state shall make these crimes punishable by appropriate penalties. 2. The United Nuwaupian Nation claims the United States has breached its obligation and is currently violating human rights by intentionally torturing and current torturing of the President of the United Nuwaupian Nation, which is a direct violation of Article 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 5 says, quote, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment," and a direct violation of its obligation to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, and Degrading Treatment. Article 1, Paragraph 2, each state shall take effective legislative, administrative measures to prevent acts of torture. No exception. No exceptional circumstances whatsoever may be invoked as a justification of torture. Number 3, the United Nuwaupian Nation claims that the United States imprisoning and current imprisoning of the sovereign head of state, President Dr. Malachi York, is a violation of the criminal immunity of a foreign head of state, an international customary rule recognized by the jurisprudence of the court. That's everywhere. Every nation, every sovereign nation, international sovereign head of state has automatic attached to their office, to their person, criminal immunity. 4, the United Nuwaupian Nation claims the United States forcing assimilation of an entire population of the United Nuwaupian Nation into foreign lands is a breach of its obligation to and a direct violation of Article 8. Look it up. 1 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Article 8:1, quote, "Indigenous peoples have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation." 5, the United Nuwaupian Nation claims that the United States destroying the culture of the United Nuwaupian Nation's indigenous peoples is a breach. It breached its obligation to and a direct violation of Article 8:1, Paragraph 2 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Look it up. Article 8 says, quote, 1, indigenous people have the right not to be subjected to the destruction of their culture. 6, the United Nuwaupian Nation claims that the United States committing acts against the United Nuwaupian Nation which had the aim and effect of depriving them of their integrity as a distinct peoples, their cultural values and ethnic identities, failing to provide preventive mechanisms and redress. They failed to redress us. They have to redress our nation. Redress is a form of payment. It says it in Article 8 again, Part 2. It's a breach. They breached their obligation. They violated this article. They violated this law. It states in Article 2, Article 8, verse 2, states shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for A, any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct. What makes us distinct? Our culture, our land, our language, our flag, our ethnic identities, our practice, our laws, our bloodline. They violated that by forcing us off of our land through their domestic law when they had no jurisdiction to do that. This is a forced action, and its effect deprived us of our entire cultural practices in any shape, form, or fashion. Number 7, the United Nuwaupian Nation claims the United States failing to provide effective mechanisms and prevention and redress for actions of illegally dispossessing indigenous land of indigenous people of the United Nuwaupian Nation is a breach of its obligation to and a direct violation of Article 8. This is a convention that's been signed by the United Nations. All 157 countries have signed on. And we'll address, because some people may have questions on, are we members of the United Nations? No, we don't have to be. And we have a right not to be. Just like the Vatican is not. And the Vatican is a sovereign nation. And they're not a part of the United Nations. They have never signed on to the United Nations. And that's why the Catholic Church has immunity, because it's a part of a sovereign nation. Therefore, you may have seen in old movies where the mob members or mob bosses, criminals would run into Catholic churches for what? Asylum, protection. And they could not touch them until they came out, because their church was considered a part of the state. The Catholic priests are considered a part of the government of the Vatican. That's why they're never criminally prosecuted for their crimes against children. Makes sense? Article 8, verse 2, Part B, the United Nations Declaration of the Indigenous Rights of People, Article 8, Part 2 states, quote, "This act deprived the United Nuwaupian Nation of their means of subsistence." What was our subsistence? Our land. Didn't we have water there? If you don't have water, what will happen? You die. So if you move people from their water, what is the intent? If you remove an indigenous people from their land where they're growing food, what do you intend to do? There's no guarantee that we were going to move into a nation that accepted us, because they didn't accept us. They haven't accepted us. We're not looking for their acceptance. But the fact that they had the audacity to forcibly move us into another land and say, go on your own, and then establish propaganda that would discriminate against us in every form or fashion, placing it in the news media, putting it on their television shows, creating documents of articles that had adverse effects to our development and caused us to be discriminated against even in their own courts. That's all against international law. And we have a right, just like China, Germany, Poland, any other country, to stand up and make the claim, or there's going to be problems. The international peace in the international community will be threatened it's going to be disruption if we don't get what we want. If we don't, they don't acknowledge our indigenous status and recognize it and release our president out of their prisons. We will embarrass them, and we have ways to embarrass them. Many ways to embarrass them. But those that know, they will definitely get embarrassed. This is not just one blow. The heavens have opened up, and the master has said he had to wait for this particular fight. Saturday he said this is the fight that he's been waiting for. This is his kind of fight. Article 10 and Article 20 of the United Nuwaupian Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Act 10 says, indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation where there's possible, with the option of, check this out, the option of return. Article 20:2, indigenous people deprived of their means of substance and development are entitled to just and fair redress. How long have we been deprived of our sustenance? How much redress do we demand? 10 years. How many bills have y'all paid 10 years outside of the land? How much money? How much school care? How much food have you brought? How many clothes had you had to buy? How many jobs had you had to go look for? How much gas you had to put in your car because you had to go to their system to find a way to make ends meet, because the U.S. was responsible for removing you from your subsistence? How much? Add it up. All of us are hurt. Don't act like we're not hurt. We are hurt by this. Our children are suffering. So, this is the judgment that we're requesting. The United States, in kidnapping, committing barbarous acts of torture, violating the human rights of a sovereign head of state, as described in the preceding statement of facts, violated and breached its international obligation to a member of the human family and rights as a human being by not preventing the acts of torture and inhumane treatment as provided by Articles 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 2 of the Convention of Torture. Therefore, any criminal liability imposed on Dr. Malachi York in violation of their international legal obligations, meaning in international law, if any state or country in the process of violating international law while they're enforcing their domestic law, all of it is void. You cannot enforce domestic law while simultaneously violating international law. It's illegal. So what we're stating is that any criminal liability imposed upon Dr. Malachi Casey York in violation of international legal obligations is void and should be recognized as void by the legal authorities of the United States. The government of the United States should restore the status quo ante. That is, reestablish the situation that existed before the detention of proceedings against and conviction and sentencing of the President of the United Nuwaupian Nation in violation of the United States international obligations that took place. See, that the government of the United States should provide President Dr. Malachi York a guarantee of non-repetition of the illegal acts committed against him. D, that the government of the United States shall pay to Dr. Malachi York in his own right and in the exercise of its right as a sovereign head of state and indigenous individual reparation for the foregoing violations of the United States international legal obligations to His Excellency Dr. Malachi York and the sum decided upon by the court. The government of the United States submit to its competent authorities for the purposes of prosecution of those persons responsible for the acts of torture committed against our President, Dr. Malachi York. The United States, when confiscating and dispossessing United Nuwaupian sovereign nation's land, from them violated and breached its obligation to indigenous peoples, right, by forcibly transferring an entire population, forcing assimilation and integration, destruction of their culture, and deprived them of their integrity as provided for in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 8. Therefore, the government of the United States should restore the status quo ante, that is, reestablish the situation that existed before confiscation and dispossessing them of their land, granting full ownership deeded back into the possession of the government of the United Nuwaupian Nation. The government of the United States should provide redress for in a form of restitution and pay to the United Nuwaupian Nation a sum to be determined by the court for forcing a population transfer, forcing assimilation and integration, and designing propaganda to promote ethnic discrimination against them, all of which deprive them of their integrity. The United Nuwaupian Nation further requests the court to indicate interim measures of protections as set forth in the separated request filed concurrently with this application. The government has designated the undersigned as his agent for the purpose of these proceedings. All communications relating to this request should be sent to Sophia Land 2, 2514, The Hague, Netherlands. Respectively submitted, Ambassador Dr. Duswa York and the United Nuwaupian Nation. So that's what's in international court now. That's just brewing. Now it's round 2. Because now it's us. They have to deal with us. One of the things that our president has explained is that he has a people's list. For those that forgot what he said in the last days when it's all said and done, and he raised his hand and says, all Nuwaupians stand up, this is the time. This is it. This is a national, and anything I'm saying, if you want to confirm it, with the Saturday visit, his office, his family, his governmental office, you can confirm it. Everything is all in line with what he wants. All right? This is a national member tribal ledger. 30,000 Nuwaupians lived on our land. 30,000. Those that know, know. Those that know, and it's documented. It's in articles. They said it in the silly behind, said it in court. They think they're a sovereign nation. Well, what made you think that? What made you look at us? You didn't say, oh, they think they're a circus. Why? Because we weren't dressed like circus people. We didn't move like circus people. You didn't say, oh, they think they are a military. We weren't operating in a military fashion. What did you think when you saw us, Sills, that you said on record? What did he say? Who remembers? They think they are a sovereign nation. Now, I wonder what would make him think that? What was it? The fact that we were operating as such because that's what we are. We had everything on our own because you saw foreign money. You never saw foreign money before? You never saw foreign passports? They do exist. We operated as what we were. But because the master in his masterful plan knew that those backwards, southern, diseased human beasts took it right to them and let their racism fold right in front of their eyes. He knew they didn't have any knowledge of international law. He knew they wouldn't be, he was 10 steps ahead of them. He knew they would violate everything that we stood for. And if you think he's not who he is, look at the plan now. Because it's evident. Our national ledger, everyone will be responsible for this in this room. If you are part of the United Nation of Nuwaupia, you'll be responsible. I'm sure all of us have hundreds of emails on our list, right? You'll be responsible for sending one of these to all Nuwaupians, wherever how distant they are, because they've been forced to assimilate and force out off of our land to assimilate in all types of places. So it's our job to get our people. It's our job to reach out to them as the master wants. And if they want to make that list, you want to make that list. He always talked about that list. You want to make the list? This is what we have to fill out. And it's going to be logged within our government. Our government has been in exile for 10 years. And it's being rebuilt. And because our people are coming forth to reestablish ourselves, right? Okay. Because this is what our president has ordered. He has commanded. Absolutely. Correct? Questions. Because the questions you have will open up. Yes. If you have anyone, of course, parents, our 13 and up. 13 and up are adults. And our law, is that correct? Correct me if I'm right. Wrong. What's our age for adulthood? 13 and up. So in our law, 13 and up, you have the ability to sign because you know what you're signing. You know what you're signing, and you know what you're making a declaration to. The question was, what is the age to sign this ledger? This is a national ledger. This is our national United Nation of Nuwaupia ledger, not letter, ledger. This is documented. This will be documented so our president will know how many members are currently standing up in our nation and representing who we are. And on here it reads, I, you put your name, being duly sworn, deposes and says, I do hereby agree and have agreed since its implementation on June 26, 1992, all put forth in the Constitution of the UNN, United Nation of Nuwaupia. I have accepted and do accept our President, Head of State of the United Nation of Nuwaupia, His Excellency, Dr. Malachi K.Z. York, as my chief, or Maku. Then you say, I hereby affirm that the information below regarding myself is true. Your Nuwaupian name, your nationality, date of birth, birth certificate number, occupation, nationality ID number, and passport ID number. Some of us have been forced to, let me explain, some of us have been forced to get documents from the United States because of our forced assimilation. We had to force ourselves, we were forced to assimilate into their society. In order to survive, a lot of us had to get these documents. You follow that? If you follow what I'm saying, you understand the direction that we're going. We were forced to assimilate into their system. So you may have an ID. You may have a passport number. It doesn't mean that we won't eventually get back to where we are issuing our own passports and issuing our own IDs. Once our president is out and our nation is fully thriving the way it's supposed to be. But until then, you make sure you just put as much information as you can. It doesn't have to be, everything doesn't have to be on there. Because some people who don't have birth certificates because they were born on our land. That's obvious. For those that were, we have many people who were raised and born in our sovereign nation who didn't have birth certificates. They don't have them because we're not a part of the United States government. You have some that have relinquished their so-called their citizenship of the United States and have become national members of the United Nation of Nuwaupia. That may be a specific case. So it just depends on your situation. Some of us lived on the land, was sovereign, and is still sovereign, and in our forcing to assimilate, you had different documents, and one day we will have to give them back all of this. That's what we're going. We have to give it back to them. It was just documentation that we needed to survive the atrocities that were perpetrated against our nation. Yeah, that's understood. And this is what needs to be stated to each and every Nuwaupian that you run across. Regardless of how they feel, it is not up to us to make the claim of who is with him and who's not. It's up to him. And this ledger will be proof of our works by the fact everyone in here will be responsible for at least 100 people getting this. Not necessarily, you having it in your possession. But the easiest way to do it is to email it, have them download it, and there will be a mass email sent out to all of our organizations, the Lodge, our chapter of Eastern Stars, AEO, our church, all of our family members will get this email worldwide. Some of them will be given it face to face. So everyone will be responsible for that. And you have to have it notarized, and the address will be in the email. Because we do have and will be establishing, it's already established actually, our embassy. Every government has an embassy. And this embassy will be acknowledged by every nation of our diplomatic post and our diplomatic mission. Because we filed this, a lot of people may not know that the moment we filed this application in international court, diplomatic immunity was reattached to our office. Do y'all understand where we are now? Diplomatic immunity was attached to our office because the United States cannot use their domestic laws to incarcerate or touch any of our president's people or nation or diplomatic office, his governmental office, because it would affect the proceedings in international court, so they cannot use their domestic laws against us. So we're moving in the right direction. So this is where we are. This is serious, and it's not a game. And we're about to go on the world stage in a very effective manner, and we have every right that anyone else has. And this is what he's been saying since 1967. So this is what will be done. This will be laid on the table. People can start. Oh, another thing we'll have as well, the copy of the pledge will be attached to it. You don't have to send the pledge with this. You can just submit this. But the pledge is just a reminder of who we are and what you pledge as a Nuwaupian. Once you have pledged to your nation and acknowledged your flag and accepted and voted your president into office. Okay? That's understood? Any other questions? I know it's far off your answer, right? We just went all. Any other questions? Your questions may bring out information that's needed to be heard, because this is going to be ongoing. This is not something just tonight. This is a movement, family. We have 16 days. I just want y'all to know this. When is June 26th? 16 days. You know what June 26th is, right? Okay, let's get involved. All right, so question. The question is, who protects sovereign nations if another nation wages war against that nation? The military of that nation. There's laws that govern war. Most of the countries, let me point out something to you. Most smaller countries, because most of them don't have access to international lawyers, because most international lawyers work for higher governments, or governments that can pay them the most, or governments that will pull them in and say, you're a part of our government. Because you're a Chinese international lawyer, who would you work for? The Chinese government. If you were a German international lawyer, who would you typically work for? The German government or German companies. You never see international lawyers advertise. You see some, but you don't see international lawyers advertising to the public. You don't ride up the street and see international attorney's office. It's rare, because international lawyers work on an international capacity, and the majority of the time they're working for government. Smaller countries, such as you get a really small country where indigenous people, indigenous family or indigenous tribes, they don't have access to the international court. Because a lot of the information in the international court is only accessible because we have the internet. And the internet only in the last 10 years became a major source of information. Prior to 10 years ago, no one knew about the international court or the proceedings that took place in the international court. You don't know. You don't know it. You didn't know that other countries can be sued. Countries can be sued, in lack of a better word, by another country. We never knew that the United States lost several times in international court. And one case they lost was against Peru. And you know what they lost? They lost the fact that Peru brought a case against the United States for locking up one of their nationals without telling them. They actually brought a case in international court. It was a man by the name of Frank Breard. The United States, state of Virginia, incarcerated him, tried him, convicted him, and sentenced him to death. And the Peru came in, intercepted the situation, brought a proceeding, which we just did, in international court, brought a proceeding to the international court, and their claim was that because the United States failed to inform them of one of their nationals being incarcerated, it breached their obligation of the 1963 Convention in Geneva of Diplomatic Relations, where they have to inform a state of incarcerating any one of their nationals, and they failed to do that. And that was one individual, one of their citizens. And it was heard in international court. They actually stated that the U.S. apologized for that. And the Peru asked that the court's judgment restore the situation back to before they locked up this Peruvian citizen. And it was granted. That's where we are. That's the kind of leverage. So we're not even worried about our problem. We're not concerned whether they're not, whether they some people are like, so are they going to, they don't have a choice but to let him go. And it's not a joke. We're not going to D.C. asking anyone for anything. Those days are over. We don't ask no more. We're tired. We did that. We gave them the ability to move. We gave them the opportunity to answer. We gave them the opportunity to communicate. They want to keep ignoring us, not sending, not writing back, not calling, not respecting our government, not respecting our president. Now it's on another level. Any other questions? Somebody, yeah. One of our good brothers here just mentioned how our president was stabbed being in population, and because of the propaganda of racism and hate that's been propagated against us by this foreign nation, he was injured. His life was threatened, and he was bodily harm was done to him. That's an injury. That's reparation. That's redress. You can't, because the United States can't be locked up because it's not a physical person. So the acts and the responsibilities of these acts of any official, let me clear this up, any official that is working in the capacity of the United States, any act that they commit that violates international law, regardless of whether they knew it or not, the United States is responsible for. Because this sheriff or this police or this detention officer is working as a United States governmental authority or governmental official. So they're responsible. So the ones that put handcuffs on him is responsible. The car that drove him to the prison is responsible. The people that brought him his food is responsible. The person that locked the door on him is responsible. The court that sentenced him is responsible. The deputy that walked him to the van is responsible. The gas station that put gas in the truck that took him to prison is responsible. All of them are responsible. Any other question? It will be mass email, so you'll definitely get it in the email. And the email, all you do is forward it. It has specific instructions in there, and it's a simple process. But the master wants 30,000 in 2 weeks. And it's going to get done, right? All right. Thank you.